Do you believe a shadow can come to life? If you're ready for chills to run down your spine, listen close. This is the story of Helen and the shadow she thought was hers, but wasn't. Helen was an ordinary woman living in an old apartment building in the heart of the city. The place had its flaws, creaking floors, peeling wallpaper, and worst of all, a dimly lit hallway that stretched longer than it should have. Her neighbors rarely used it, opting instead for the fire escape stairs or the building's other wing. The hallway, however, was Helen's daily path to her apartment. Every evening, after leaving her job, Helen would walk through that hallway, carrying groceries or a day's burdens. Nothing had ever happened in those fluorescent-lit spaces. Until last month. At first, it was subtle, a strange heaviness in the air as she walked. She dismissed it, thinking it might be fatigue or imagination. After all, work at the local diner was often grueling. Then, one night, Helen noticed something off. As she unlocked her door, her shadow stretched too far down the hall. She laughed it off, thinking it was merely a trick of the light. She stepped inside her apartment, shook off her nerves, and that was it. Or so she thought. The next morning, Helen woke with the uncanny feeling of being watched. As she prepared her breakfast, she felt followed. But her apartment was a simple one-bedroom unit. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. She peeked into her closet, behind furniture, and under her bed. All was clear. By sunset that same day, Helen walked home. The hallway seemed eerily quiet, as though the usual faint buzz of the lights had gone silent. As she looked down, she noticed her shadow again, long and distorted. What unnerved her was that it didn't entirely mimic her movements. Helen raised her left hand. The shadow raised its right. She tapped her foot. The shadow rippled unnaturally, as if it were made of smoke rather than darkness. Panic strained her breath as she dashed to her apartment door, fumbling with the key and locking herself in. Inside, she exhaled a shaky breath and laughed nervously. Seriously, she thought, shadows don't act like that. It's exhaustion, stress. Days turned into weeks, and constant unease plagued her every minute. Helen avoided her hallway whenever she could, timing her errands to avoid the setting sun, or standing in her doorway until she could catch a neighbor crossing to their own. Yet, nothing could erase the lingering sense of dread. One Friday, Helen vowed she had had enough. Armed with a flashlight, she decided to confront the hallway after dark, a decision she'd soon regret. The flashlight beam swept across the walls, thin and narrow. Her own shadow trailed obediently behind her. And yet, a second shadow appeared in the beam's light. This shadow was inexplicably darker, denser, and it moved in ways that shadows shouldn't. It twitched and flowed like it was alive. The figure wasn't tall like Helen. No, it was hunched, lurking low to the floor. Whatever it belonged to, it wasn't human. Helen froze, and the world around her became eerily still. She stood there, clutching the flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then it moved. The shadow crept toward her, stretching against the walls and ceiling like a predatory fog. Helen screamed and dropped the flashlight as its beam failed. She snapped out of it in a flash of panic when she felt, the shadow stop mere inches from her foot. She bolted back to her door. Trembling, she slammed it shut and locked all 3 bolts. For days, she avoided the hallway altogether, practically camping out in her apartment when she wasn't at work. However, Helen couldn't avoid the truth forever. It wasn't just the hallway anymore. The shadow wasn't bound to it. Twice, Helen thought she saw flutters of movement in her room, the reflection of shapes darting across her mirrors, lurking at the corners of her vision. She got rid of her bedroom lamp with horror, after noticing that the shadow cast by its light did not dissipate when the bulb was turned off. Then came the strange whispers at night. Whispers Helen couldn't understand, but felt had weight, as though they pressed against her eardrums. The breaking point wasn't a whisper, or the shadow's invasion of her significance. It was the final time she used that hallway. She was returning from grocery shopping during daytime, thinking daylight would protect her. When it happened, her shadow seemed to unhinge itself from her entirely, slipping off the soles of her feet and congealing into its own grotesque form. Face to face with it, Helen gasped. The hollow sockets where eyes should be stared her down. The laughter whispering through the thing's formless edges mocked her terror. She dropped her groceries, retreating one step, then another. The shadow followed her, not fast, but steady. She turned to run, and when she finally looked back, the hallway was empty again. Quiet, ordinary. Helen left her apartment the next day. She broke her lease, leaving behind clothes, furniture, and even family photos. Nothing was worth staying. But even then, Helen admitted to feeling no relief. Because by then, the shadow wasn't tied to her hallway or that building anymore. It had followed her. To this day, Helen still lives in fear. The whispers have softened, and the movements are rarely noticeable. Yet the dread remains alive in her heart. And her shadow never looks quite right under the sun. So remember, the next time you see your shadow out of place, or it doesn't respond to your movements, don't laugh it off so easily. Some things are meant to remain untouched by human understanding. Some shadows have a life of their own,